In today's video, we're going to be ranking every single champion from easiest to hardest for Season 16. There are two different ways in which you can approach a difficulty ranking, either ranking by skill floor, which is how difficult a champion is to pick up and find a baseline level of success with, or skill ceiling, which is how difficult it is to master a champion to their limits. For the sake of this video, we're going to be rating based on skill ceiling. So which champions are the most difficult to truly master in League of Legends? We're going to be covering each role and place champions in 4 unique tiers. The first tier will be the easy tier, and you'll find the champions with the lowest mastery curve in this tier. Second tier will be medium, third tier will be hard, and then all the way up to the expert tier where you'll find champions that are almost impossible to actually master, even with thousands of games played. And remember, if you're learning new tech, broken builds, or macro and wave control strategies from videos like this one, you're already behind. By the time something hits your feed, it's either about to get patched or everyone already knows about it and knows how to play around it. That's why whenever our challenger players discover new tech, broken builds, or game-winning strategies, they post it immediately in our new meta updates course, weeks before you'll ever see it on YouTube, Reddit, or TikTok. For instance, AP Varus top lane was broken from the very first patch of the season, but the average player didn't discover that until a few weeks later, while SkillCapped subscribers were notified before everyone else. As a SkillCapped subscriber, you're also getting access to our newly updated Essentials courses, covering everything you need to master Season 16, from fundamentals to advanced macro. Or even our Bronze to Diamond series, where we document hard-stuck players using only our content to climb through every rank. And if that wasn't enough already, every single week our challenger players upload 10 full game commentaries breaking down exactly how to carry games on your chosen champion in your elo, explaining every decision in real time. Best of all, you can get access to all this and more completely risk-free. As if you don't climb at least 5 divisions while actively using our service, then you get every penny back. Check out the link in the description below for an exclusive one-time discount completely risk-free today. So we're going to start off with top lane and then work our way down to bot, and first let's have a look at the top lane easy tier. So there's not a whole lot of complexity when it comes down to these champs, as they have very basic trading patterns and not a whole lot of ways in which they can optimally play fights. For example, Nasus doesn't have multiple combos that he has to use depending on the situation. He literally just bonks his opponents with his Q, slows them with W whenever it's up, and tosses E down when it's available. To master Nasus, it's more about your general game knowledge and being able to split push effectively that takes the champ to another level, and not so much anything specific from his kit. You could argue that Malphite may deserve a slightly higher difficulty ranking than the other picks we have here, just because there is a decent ceiling in regards to target selection with his R in team fights. I'm sure we've all had that Malphite player on our team who just whiffs his R on nobody or ults the tank instead of the carry, so mastering him may be slightly more difficult than the likes of Garen, Nasus, or Mundo. However, we still think it's relatively easy compared to the majority of top lane picks. For our medium tier top lane champions, this is where the majority of the champions lie, as most of them are in and around that middle ground. So take Urgot for example. Definitely not all that difficult to master, but when compared with someone like Nasus, there's more nuance that goes into playing an optimal Urgot. Positioning in fights so that you can get maximum DPS with your passive, use your R at the correct time and on the correct target, toggling W on and off in different situations for max DPS. So even though it's really not that hard to find a baseline level of success with Urgot when you first pick him up, actually getting the most out of the champion's kit will take you a bit more time than the easy tier picks. Same thing goes for Set. The way in which you combo with Set is pretty basic, but stuff like knowing when to activate your W in a fight, using W flash to one-shot carries, and choosing which target to R in a grouped up team fight all makes Set slightly more difficult than easy tier. The hard tier is where we get into champions who have more advanced mechanical aspects of their kits or very unique elements that no other champs have. Rumble is a good example of a champ with a more unique element, as he's got his passive heat that he needs to play around. Although you could probably first time Rumble and be able to play him at an impactful level, really mastering the champion to its limits is not easy. Maximizing Rumble's heat so that he receives max DPS while overheating at the correct time in fights is a skill that takes a while to learn. If you don't manage your heat correctly, then you'll either be missing out on loads of damage or completely put yourself out of the fight by overheating. Singed is a really good example of a champion with a lower skill floor but a higher skill ceiling. Since Riot gave Singed the minion execute if his Q poison is ticking on them, it's made it way easier to find a baseline level of success with Singed. Just look at his win rate in Bronze and Silver. He's constantly the highest win rate champ for those ranks, which goes to show that it doesn't take a super skilled player to win with Singed. At the same time though, actually mastering Singed to his limits is a lot harder than it may look. You've got the ability to proxy on Singed, and knowing how to do this effectively to avoid certain matchups is really key to maximizing the champ's limits. Proxying is even more powerful in Season 16 as well, because if the enemy tries to stop you, then they lose progress towards their role quest, whereas you do not, so it's a really important skill to learn on Singed. And then of course we have picks like Aurelia, Riven, or Fiora who have so much outplay potential due to the many ways in which they can approach fights. For example, with Aurelia, target selection is super important. The timing in which you choose to use your stun is really key. Hitting a multi-man R and then dashing around to get resets from Q so that you can dodge skill shots is extremely difficult, so from a mechanical standpoint, many of these champs have very high ceilings. And then we've got got League's newest champion, Zehen, placed in the hard tier, but you could argue that he should be in medium. The reason we have Zehen placed in the hard tier isn't because he's very difficult mechanically, but because of how playing around his passive stacks is going to change with every game and every fight. Choosing the correct moment to dive into fights, knowing exactly how many passive stacks you're going to get if you dive in during that moment, and just overall maximizing the potential of Zehen's passive from game to game has a pretty high skill ceiling. And then for the expert tier for top lane, we've got 3 champions being Yasuo, Kled, and Gangplank. There's so much that goes into playing an optimal Yasuo, as being able to teamfight efficiently if you don't have any knockups from your teammates is really hard to do. Optimal wind wall usage in fights, dashing through minions as fast as possible to close the gap on targets, all the unique combos that he can use depending on the situation. There's really just limitless amounts of things you can do to improve at Yasuo, and truly mastering him is incredibly hard. Kled takes a spot in expert tier, not so much because of the fact he's difficult mechanically, but because of his unique mounted and unmounted forms, and the fact that taking each form to its limits has a really high ceiling. Knowing exactly how much damage you need to deal to remount, knowing if you have enough health to win a 1v1, you just need a lot of games on Kled to really understand what you can and cannot do in different situations, so he's super hard to master. And then for Gangplank, his triple barrel combo alone is one of the most difficult combos to learn in League. Using his barrels to their absolute limits is something that very few players can do, and it's just such a unique ability, so there's no transfer of skill from playing top lane as a whole. You have to play so much of Gangplank himself in order to get the most out of him. Moving on over to jungle now. If we start off with the easy tier, we have a bunch of different champs. Rammus is your prototypical easy tier jungler, as he doesn't have any crazy combos. The way in which he looks to approach a fight isn't going to be much different in each game, and is clear is not hard to do optimally. If Rammus is the easiest of easy, then someone like Nocturne you could argue for a slightly higher difficulty rating, but placing him in medium still feels too high. With Nocturne, your spell shield does have a bit of a skill ceiling, because saving it for an impactful spell in a skirmish can often be more optimal than just spamming it as soon as you enter a fight. Target selection with Nocturne R is important, but you could honestly say that for most dive junglers, so it's not something that's unique to him. The simplicity in the way you look to combo your spells is something that a lot of these champions have in common. There aren't multiple different ways in which you can combo with Mundo. You just toss your Q and follow with E when you get in range. Trundle just smacks enemies with his Q. Amumu is always Q for engage followed up by E, so even if you play a ton of games on these picks, there's not massive room for improvement compared to many other junglers. The medium tier for jungle is going to feature champs who are still on the easier side, but often have one aspect in their kit that makes them slightly harder to master. Master Yi is a good example, because even though he's relatively easy mechanically, the way in which you choose to use your Q and W during fights is something that has a bit of a skill ceiling. You don't always want to use your Q right as you enter a fight, because saving it to dodge a Q spell can be way more impactful. For example, if you are skirmishing against an Echo as Master Yi and the Echo throws down his W, then you ideally want to wait to use your Q for when Echo's W stun is coming down, so that you can dodge the stun entirely. Just little things like this, to where depending on the enemy comp, you're going to shift how you play, which gives Yi a higher skill ceiling than the easy tier picks. Warwick is another champ who a lot of players may be surprised is not in the easy tier, but because of how Warwick gains in power the lower he drops on health, it provides a ceiling to his skirmish that isn't easy to master right away. You've definitely got to get your games in on Warwick to understand his limits in skirmishes and how powerful he becomes when he's on lower health. The hard tier for jungle is going to consist of a mixed bag of champions that are either more difficult to master mechanically, they have unique ways in which they clear their jungle, or they have a unique part of their kit that no other champion has to offer. Kindred is one of those picks with a unique part to her kit, as marks are something that no other jungler has to focus on. Kindred's marks just makes it so that she has this separate mini game that she's got to focus on, and it really adds to the skill ceiling of the pick, as you already have to be focused on so much as a jungler, but this just adds a whole nother layer. And then just being a ranged jungler in itself gives Kindred a higher skill ceiling than most junglers, because you've got to be able to position well and kite effectively to be most impactful on the champ. Bel'Veth is a jungler whose skill ceiling is mainly derived from the mechanical skill required to master her. The fact that you've got 4 dashes with Q means you have so many different ways in which you can use the spell in fights. Choosing which way to dash, whether you should be saving a dash or not, understanding exactly how much ground you can close with each charge are all things that will take you quite a bit of time to optimize. And then for the jungle expert tier, we have 4 champions being Ivern, Elise, Nidalee, and Viego. So starting with Ivern, Daisy micromanagement is one of the most unique mechanics in the game and has a really high skill ceiling. Because of this, you're going to need to spend a ton of time on Ivern in order to reach his max potential. For Nidalee, the fact that she is so reliant on landing a skill shot to be most effective makes her really difficult to master. Playing mechanically perfect in skirmishes is just so difficult with Nidalee that even with thousands of games played, you'd be hard pressed to have an absolutely flawless game. Elise, with her ability to tower dive so effectively early on, gives her quite a high skill ceiling. Knowing how many tower shots you can soak for your team, recognizing a dive play in the first place, and then executing on it with your teammate is not easy to master in the slightest. And then for Viego, you literally need to know what every single champion in the game does in order to play him optimally. If you dive in on a Vel'Koz, end up getting a kill, pick up your passive and are now playing as Vel'Koz, if you don't know how to angle his Q to extend the range and and finish off a kill, then you can just miss out on a potential game-winning kill. Viego may have the highest skill ceiling for any champion in the entire game because of his passive. Moving on to mid lane, the easy tier is going to consist of champs who have very linear ways in which they can approach fights. If you want to go in with Naafiri, then you're always going to use R on your target, follow with Q and E, and then use W to reposition. There isn't anything complicated about that, and it adds for a very low skill ceiling. Same thing with Annie. The majority of fights, you're just looking for that R stun on a priority target, and will follow up with your Q and W. Nothing too complicated at all, and the only thing you may change from time to time is whether or not you lead with your R, or just simply use Q or W if you feel like R would be overkill. Even if you put thousands of games in on Malzahar, oftentimes the most optimal thing for you to do in a fight is going to be to simply press R on a fed carry. Whether you have 2 games or 1,000 games on Malz, the player with 2 games isn't going to play any differently if Yasuo is diving on them in a late game fight. So overall, there's just much less skill expression from these champions, and you can't exponentially increase your skill by putting in thousands of games. For the medium tier mid laners, many of these champs are actually pretty easy from a mechanical standpoint, but tend to require more game knowledge in order to get the most out of them. Kassadin is a good example of a champ who doesn't require any crazy combos to be effective, but knowing how to play macro in the mid game is a lot more important on someone like Cass than it is on Malz or Annie. With Malz and Annie, the most optimal thing for you to do in the majority of games is to group up and team fight, but with Kassadin, his side lane threat is incredible, so in order to master him, you need to know how to play through the side lane effectively. Veigar is a relatively easy champion to master, but when compared to the easy tier champs, there's a bit more that goes into mastering him. Optimal E placement is something that even Veigar players who have hundreds of games on him won't use absolutely perfectly in skirmishes. Everything else about the champ is pretty linear, but E usage is going to take you a good amount of games to master. Most of these champs are similar to Veigar, where they have one part of their kit which takes a good amount of time to master, but everything else is pretty simple. For the mid lane hard tier, this is where we get into champs who have very unique elements to their kits, or champs that have many different ways in which they can approach fights. Orianna is a good example of having a unique element in her ball tracking. Being able to keep track of exactly where your ball is in a fight, constantly repositioning it to zone, and having it in the correct spot to maximize the potential multi-man R are all things that take a good chunk of time to master. The decision to use E on a teammate as opposed to keeping your ball on the ground also has massive implications on later game fights, and it can often be really hard to choose which is most optimal. Twisted Fate is a champion who has a pretty low skill floor but a very high skill ceiling. The way in which you choose to use your ultimate in the mid game is a skill that takes a while to learn. You need to be so aware of what's happening on the entire map at all times while also staying focused on the lane in front of you, so that alone gives TF a higher skill ceiling than most mid laners. Expert tier for mid lane is going to revolve around 4 champions, being Vel'Koz, Uxin, Yasuo, and Azir. For Uxin, what makes his skill ceiling incredibly high is his E. Uxin E is one of the most unique spells in the entire game, and truly mastering how to use it the most optimally around all sorts of terrain will take you hundreds of games. Vel'Koz's Q is one of the highest skill gap spells in the entire game. All the different angles in which you can use the spell to hit an enemy gives you so many different ways in which you can approach fights. There are just so many kill opportunities awaiting for Vel'Koz throughout the game if he can hit an angled Q, but it really depends on how mastered the Vel'Koz player is as to whether or not they will be able to capitalize on that kill. Purely from a mechanical standpoint, Yasuo is one of the most difficult champions to master in League. There are so many different combos that you can use with Yasuo depending on the situation, and choosing the correct one at every single moment is extremely difficult to do. And then for Azir, he could honestly be in an expert plus tier on his own, as there's just so many ways in which he can approach fights, which gives him a very high skill ceiling. The fact Azir has the ability to either dive the backline himself or sit in behind his team and be a safe DPS threat gives you many options to think about. You always have to be pondering whether or not now is the right moment to try and dive in and catch out the enemy squishy, and then actually executing on it mechanically is a whole nother story. Just micromanaging Azir's soldiers and moving them around in the optimal spot with Q during fights also adds to Azir's infinite skill ceiling. Heading down to the bot lane now, if we have a look at the easy tier for ADC, we've got Misfortune, Sivir, and Smolder. MF is a no-brainer in this tier because regardless of how many games you have played on the champ, you're looking to do the same thing in every fight, which is press R. Pressing R in the correct moment and at the correct angle does take a bit of time to learn, but relative to all other ADCs, Misfortune is one of the easiest champions to master. Smolder is also quite easy to master because he has his point-and-click damage coming out of Q, and it's really just the way in which you position throughout a fight that's going to differentiate an average from a mastered Smolder. Since a lot of Smolder's damage comes from weaving in his point-and-click Q, it makes his skill ceiling a lot lower than the majority of ADCs who are very reliant on auto-weaving to deal max DPS. And then Sivir is pretty simple to master because she literally has a spell within her kit that makes positioning way easier thanks to her R. So while many other ADCs can get punished really hard for making a small misstep in a fight, it's very easy for Sivir to correct those while she also has the spell shield from her E, so getting the most out of her in a team fight is easier than on a lot of other ADCs. Medium tier for ADC is going to consist of pretty straightforward champions who are a little more reliant on auto-weaving and positioning than the easy tier champs. With MF and Smolder, the optimal way to play them in fights often doesn't revolve around constant auto-weaving, and with Sivir, you don't need to worry as much about positioning because of your R movement speed. Jinx, Tristana, Ashe, Cog, and Twitch are all super reliant on immaculate auto-weaving to play them optimally, while their positioning in fights is also super key, minus Trist since she has the gap closer. Varus and Corki are a bit more skill shot reliant than most ADCs, so even though they aren't too complicated, it will take you more time to master them than our easy tier picks. For Kog'Maw and Twitch, we did consider placing them in the hard tier, but the only thing that's truly difficult about them is positioning well in fights, as they aren't very hard to play from a mechanical standpoint. If we transition right over to the hard tier, we find picks like Zeri and Yanara, who relative to Twitch and Cog require way more mechanical skill to master, while also requiring excellent positioning in fights due to their shorter ranges. Jhin is a very unique ADC in the sense that he's very skill shot reliant with his R, and the way in which you use your R in fights has a very high skill ceiling. Playing mind games with opponents by holding your R charge for longer to force them into a predictable pattern, holding R for if your teammate has some CC they're about to use, just choosing when to R in a fight as opposed to auto attacking, are all things that provide Jhin with a more exponential mastery curve. Nilah, Samira, Kai'Sa, Vayne, and Xayah are all relatively shorter ranged ADCs, so this magnifies the importance of positioning in fights even more than on most ADCs. In medium tier, we had Jinx, Twitch, Cog, and Trist, who all have range enhancers in their kits, which makes mastering them a bit easier. Nilah and Samira in specific are such unique ADCs, and being shorter range, the timing in which you decide to go in during a fight is so much more important. Mastering team fighting with Nilah and Samira is just so much harder than most ADCs because of the fact that you have to be so close up in order to be most effective. And then rounding things out with the expert tier, we've got Kalista, Draven, and Ezreal. So Ezreal being entirely skill shot reliant for the majority of his DPS, along with all the different angles that you can find in fights by repositioning with E, makes him a champ that is nearly impossible to master. If you watch some of the best Ezreal players in the world play him, and then you go into your solo queue games and watch an Ezreal on your team, that's going to say enough as to how hard he really is to master. Kalista, with her passive hop mechanic, is always going to have an extremely high skill ceiling. Just getting used to this mechanic alone is going to take you a ton of games, and then mastering it within skirmishes, hopping in the correct direction, and kiting perfectly in fights is really difficult to do. And then Draven with his axe mechanic has a very steep mastery curve. All other ADCs just have to track their positioning in fights, but Draven has to do this on top of tracking where his axes are landing, so it literally adds another layer of focus that no other ADC has to deal with. So if we round out the video by looking at the support role, we've got a handful of champs in the easy tier. When it comes down to hook supports, I don't think it's much of an argument to say that Nautilus is the easiest. The thing that lowers Naught's skill ceiling compared to other hook supports like Thresh, Blitz, and Pyke is the fact the hitbox on his hook is super wide, combined with the fact that he can just point and click R from range on an enemy, and then once the CC from R lands, he gets to follow with a guaranteed hook. This is the bread and butter combo for Naught in skirmishes, as R followed up by Q takes no skill to use at all, and it's often the most optimal combo to use. Yuumi is a bit of a weird one to rate on this list because her skill floor is really low, but one could argue that her skill ceiling is actually higher than some of these easy tier picks. Things like hopping off your ADC to block damage in skirmishes, or using R at the correct moments and at the correct angle in fights aren't actually that easy to grasp right away, so we could definitely see the argument for her being a medium tier skill ceiling support. Medium tier is where the majority of support champions are going to fall, as most of these champs just have slightly higher ceilings than the easy tier picks. It's not like Braum is all that more difficult than Nautilus, but stuff like hitting Qs consistently, using W on minions to set up plays, Q flashing to find picks, and timing E usage in fights to block the most amount of damage are things that provide a somewhat higher skill ceiling. Braum just has a little more that he has to be thinking about during skirmishes, as it's not just, oh, I look to land my CC on a priority target, and more so, okay, I've got to land my CC, but then I also have to focus on being in the right position to block damage for my team. In a vacuum, Sona is an enchanter that may seem very simple, and her skill floor isn't that high, but using her passive most optimally in fights is what leads to her having a higher skill ceiling. Same thing with Lulu. If you just throw all your spells down on your carry in a fight, then you're going to perform just fine, but it's optimizing whether you save W to polymorph a dive threat or use it on your carry, and choosing the correct decision in a fight that leads to Lulu being a little more difficult than someone like Melio. The hard tier for support is going to consist of champions that tend to have a lot more playmaking potential in their kits, which leads to them being more difficult to master. Blitz, Renata, Rakan, Nico, and Pyke all thrive off of being able to recognize small windows within a skirmish and then immediately diving in to punish the enemy's missteps. This alone leads to them having higher skill ceilings because you need a pretty high level of game knowledge in order to get the most out of them. For instance, the best play for a Lulu or a Soraka in a team fight is almost always going to be to sit in behind their carries and peel for them. There often isn't anything more optimal for them to be doing, so this takes a lot of mental burden off of you. With someone like Rakan or Renata though, they not only have the ability to dive the back line with flash plays, but they also have great peel strength, so understanding how to get the most out of their kits for each specific team comp that you're playing into is not easy to master. Nami is an enchanter that you could argue argue should be in the medium tier instead of hard, but there is quite a big gap between an average and a mastered Nami player. Bubble optimization and correct R usage in fights is something that the majority of average Nami players fail miserably at getting right, and the ceiling of using both spells correctly is definitely quite high. So Nami would be one of those picks where we think her skill floor is quite low, because you can still achieve a baseline level of success with her by just using W and E on teammates, but the skill ceiling of Nami is higher due to Q and R optimization. And to round out the video, the expert tier for support is going to feature Taric, Thresh, Vel'Koz, Bard, and Elise. So what makes a lot of these champions more difficult to master is that they have at least one spell in their kit that has an infinite skill ceiling. Vel'Koz, Bard, and Taric are these three champs, as Vel'Koz Q is one of the most difficult spells in the game to master. Bard with his R and even his Q provide a massive ceiling, while Taric has his ultimate. Taric's ultimate is one spell that is so difficult to min-max in a fight because choosing the correct time to use the spell is really difficult. 1 second too late and your teammate could die, but 1 second too early and the enemy team just retreats as they don't want to fight with Taric R coming down. Actually using Taric R to its limits in every single fight is pretty much impossible, so the skill ceiling to the champ is infinite. For Thresh, he's a support who has so many ways in which he can approach fights. Not only does he have a skill shot that he has to land, but he's got to decide whether or not he should be sitting back and peeling for his carry or trying to dive in and catch out the enemy carry. Maximizing Thresh's kit requires more game knowledge than most supports because of his ability to shift how he positions and what his priority is in fights based on compositions. If you're an ADC main, I'm sure you've all had that one Thresh on your team who just constantly tries to dive in and find hook plays, while in reality, he should be sitting back more and giving you lanterns so that you can play up more aggressive as a fed ADC. And then for Elise, she's a super unique support because her early game roam power and dive strength is unmatched by most supports, which requires more split-second decision making. Choosing the correct times to roam, recognizing dive plays, and then executing on the play are all things that you need to get good at to master Elise, which gives her a very high skill ceiling. Alright guys, one last thing, our rank up guarantee is insane. It's like signing up for the gym and getting a refund if you don't get ripped. That's how confident we are in SkillCapped. We obsess over making the best guides with top players, rigorous testing, and top tier video editing to make your climb easy. If you're ready to level up, visit SkillCapped.com and see the difference. So there you have it everyone, those are our rankings of the most difficult champions to master for Season 16. Thank you all so much for watching, we'll see you in the next one.